Today, my colleague Talatu and I, we want to share with you a model that we piloted for shifting power in international development research, and also then for thinking about how do we decolonize our research partnerships. And this was piloted in a multi-country program called ECID, which stands for Evidence and Collaboration for Inclusive Development. But Talatu, before we start, can you tell us briefly what the ESET program is all about?
Sure, Cathy. So the Evidence and Collaboration for Inclusive Development, ECID in short, was an innovative intervention which was focused on enhancing civil society effectiveness in evidence-based or data-driven management for effective service delivery and improve inclusiveness of marginalized groups. So the project was aimed to helping in reducing poverty, realize the rights and well-being of marginalized people in Myanmar, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. It was a multi-country project. So what we found out is that people living in extreme poverty are prevented from accessing basic and essential services that should be accessible to all. So what we did in ECID was that we worked with communities to gain insight into what it means to be excluded from these services. So this was backed up with data as evidence, and this is being used to influence decision makers to provide inclusive services which leaves no one behind. So for us in Nigeria, the project was looking at 3 categories of people which we have termed to be marginalized. And these are adolescent boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 19, people living with disability, and poor rural women from age of 19 and above, living in hard-to-reach communities. So the project was implemented in 2 states in Nigeria, one in the southern part of Nigeria and the other in the northern part of Nigeria. Anambra in the southeast of Nigeria, and Kaduna State in northwest Nigeria. So generally, for us in Nigeria, the project looked at the well-being of over 200,000 marginalized groups, talking about these adolescent boys and girls, people living with disability, and poor rural women in hard-to-reach communities. So the project aims to support also civil society, marginalized groups, and the government to collect data and use it as evidence for effective engagement for participation and in policy and decision making. So that is just the short overview of the project in Nigeria. Remember, it was a multi-country project. It happened in Nigeria, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe.
Brilliant, thanks Talatu. So yes, if I remember correctly, it was very much had the sort of program component that it was generating evidence, but then it also had very much a research component that was looking at doing research for new knowledge. But Talatu, I come from an academic background where we have very strict sort of policies and the guidelines to follow when we're doing research. But sometimes the approach can feel a little extractive, and often it feels more like a tick box exercise rather than really thinking about the ethics of what we're doing. But you've been working in international development for a long time now, and from what I've seen, if we had to directly apply the same approach to research ethics, it doesn't always work in the same way. So I was wondering, maybe, can you just tell me a little bit more about what you think we need to consider when integrating research into an international development program, but particularly what we need to consider so that we can make sure we're thinking about our research perhaps in a broader ethical way and to ensure that it's equitable?
Okay. So thank you, Cathy. Yes, I think the ESET project was really an eye-opener. So for us, what we think we should consider for doing research ethically in international NGOs, one thing we have found out is that we do not have research ethics committees. but we have our various siloed policies and guidance. And then how do we shift power in development is something that we should consider. Yeah, how do we shift power in development research to make it less extractive and more inclusive of the most marginalized and those living in poverty? So the things that we have in mind is trying to think about shifting the locus of power in knowledge production, moving away, moving beyond the procedural and perspective ethics associated with formal ethical review processes, and build more equitable partnership. Then again, Cathy, you know, in general, INGOs don't have a formal ethic review process. So instead, we do have a lot of different policies and general practices, guidelines regarding to like safeguarding and protection, quality standards, accountability, security, gender equality, social inclusion, you just name it. This can make it very, very challenging, you know, in a policy environment to navigate. However, in our development work, we have a very strong value on participation and inclusion. So we need to be asking how we can shift power in development research to make it less extractive and more inclusive of most marginalized and people and those living in poverty. There are ethical issues in which we need to consider how research can be carried out in a way that shifts the locus of power in knowledge. So for us to consider how this can be carried out, the production that is held in the global north to the south, we need to think about knowledge justice, which requires moving beyond the procedural perspective of ethic, which one might associate with formal ethical review processes found in academic institutions. And it also requires us thinking about how we can build more equitable research partners, you know? But Cathy, I think I know you have been engaging with these issues quite a bit. Can you also tell me more about what you've been doing to address some of these challenges, and especially how you can address that in the, how you were able to address that in the ECID program?
Yeah, I can. And it certainly was a challenge when we tried to address it, because as you say, there's loads and loads of different policies. Trying to navigate that policy environment is very, very challenging. So we did a number of things, Talatu. What we did, the first thing that we did was to try to develop what we called a research ethics and integrity framework. And that was supplemented by an implementation guide to help development practitioners actually implement some of the guidelines we were trying to develop. And the purpose of this framework was to set out the minimum and actually ideal standards as well for practice relating to all research activity. And we define this as including any sort of purposeful commissioning, collection, analysis, adaptation, or representation and communication of data. It also set out specific parameters for ethics and quality assurance in relation to the purposeful data mobilization activity, bearing in mind that our own values and desires influence our choice from the data we collect and choose to collect to the questions that we ask. So that was sort of this first aspect, was trying to develop this framework and trying to put all of these different policies and things together. And it was also important to define, in doing this, it was important to define what we meant by research, because we found that often if we use the term research, actually it didn't always resonate because it's not something that international development organizations historically have done. But actually this was really about thinking about any evidence generating activities we do. And this particular program was generating a lot of evidence. But But developing and integrating this framework into ESET was a challenging process. On the one hand, the framework was useful because it was able to raise awareness around ethical issues that needed to be considered, and particularly for trying to improve the quality of evidence that was being generated. Because if you think about it, quite often a research ethics application isn't only looking at the ethical issues, it's also looking at the methodologies that are used. And so this was a part of it. And actually, you'll also recall when we began to develop this framework, it was you in Nigeria who recognized that actually what was missing was the need to think about conflict-sensitive approaches to doing research. And as such, we were able to integrate that aspect of it in this, and became quite a useful way to think through the ethical risks that were associated with the discrete pieces of research we were doing and the various evidence gathering that we were doing. But it was actually also a very instrumental framework for shaping a guide and a toolkit for doing research and evaluation ethically that we developed then in partnership with Tier Fund. And you can see an image and a link to the tool on the slides. But this guide explores the ethical principles that ought to be considered at each stage of the research or evaluation project cycle. And it tries to give ethical consideration at each of those points. However, simply having the framework certainly wasn't enough to actually avoid the research being extractive and for shifting power in research. For example, it wasn't able to engage with the question of whose ethics counts, and therefore whose ethics should inform the research, or with the, it also didn't engage with the purpose of informed consent and what the benefit of informed consent is and how it's interpreted across different cultures. And these are issues that are being contested, particularly in the global South, and challenging sort of the hegemony that the West has over knowledge production and around whose ethics counts. So that was the first step that we took, was to develop this framework to guide our thinking and our processes. The second action that we took was to see how we could decentralize the research process. And this was particularly critical. The first thing that we had to do was look at decentralizing the budget to the research partners based in the countries where ESET was working. And this is a particular challenge, I think, in the funding world generally. But once we were able to decentralize the budget, we were then able to develop locally based hybrid research teams. And these hybrid teams had academics and practitioners in the team. And by creating the teams in this way, we felt that we were able to maximize sort of the methodological rigor and the thematic expertise that was held by the academics. And then we were able to also utilize the thematic expertise and the contextual understanding that was held by the development practitioner. And this combination together, we felt, was particularly useful for doing contextually appropriate research for greater impact for the communities the ESET program was targeting. And it was also a useful way for investigating different interpretations of key concepts in the program. For example, one program was looking particularly at how disability was interpreted across different cultural contexts, and for ensuring that the authors from the Global South were also included in that research and in the literature reviews. So in this way, centering community knowledge, we thought was integral, is definitely integral to promoting knowledge justice. And then after sort of developing the hybrid research teams, what we did is we used a course called Evidence for Development Professionals. This was an online course developed with Christian Aid and the Open University. And we used this course as a way of co-designing the research on an online forum. Because shifting power in research also necessitates a more equitable approach to designing research. And so this was very useful for sort of co-creating, taking each step of the research process and co-creating it together and for receiving feedback. And yeah, we thought it was a helpful way for linking the theory of research design and implementation to the practice of doing development. But Talatu, I'm saying a lot about the course. You were part of the online forum. Do you want to say a little bit more about your experience of it and how it worked?
Yeah, thank you, Cathy. That was a very nice experience. And for me, it was an innovation for me. So my experience for the online forum, so we had these hybrid research teams who met on a weekly basis to collaborate on different aspects of the research design, such as identifying the knowledge gap, designing the research objectives and research questions, selecting the appropriate methodologies, and to develop research communication strategies. So this online forum took 7 weeks. Yeah, it took 7 weeks for the hybrid research team to always meet. So the research team said that they found this to be particularly very useful for collaborating and designing the research. I also found that very, very useful. It was also a useful way of building relationships, which are central to the success of any partnership. And again, Cathy, we also took a third action, we created a hybrid panel comprising both practitioners and academics from each of the country in which the research was located. So we had practitioners and academicians from Nigeria, from Myanmar, and from Zimbabwe, and from the UK. So this was an innovative practice in an international NGO, if you ask me. It's a very, very innovative practice. And it's decentralized, and academic practice hybrid can also be a model for any NGO and universities in search for research for impact. It can be a model for anybody that wants to, imbibe that. So the panel was decentralized and formed by members from all participating countries, just like I earlier said, in Nigeria, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe, and the UK. It also included practitioners in ethics and research groups rather than just academics. And this panel was supported by integrated research and ethics framework. So the role of the panel was to review and to provide feedback on the research, of each country team, on the research of what each country team has designed. And while this was quite an innovative way of engaging with an ethic review board, it was particularly helpful for ensuring that research was contextually appropriate and aligned with the goals of ESET program. So, and also for shifting power, over whose knowledge and ethic counts in research. So in this way, the panel was able to strengthen the ethics and quality of research projects, and also it was able to ensure that program alignment and research are used for impact, and also there was that shifting in power in research. So I found that collaboration and that online platform very, very innovative and very, very helpful for me. This was the first of its kind for us to sit down as practitioners and as academics to sit down and deliberate on what and how to carry out a research. It shows a sense of ownership. I felt that a sense of belonging, as opposed to the research being gazed in one-sided, but it shows that participation, collaboration, and inclusiveness. So I don't know, Cathy, based on our experience of the ESET program, what would you say that we need to do in order to shift this power in research and build more equitable partnership?
That's a great question, Talatu. For me, I think if I was to summarize our experience and what we've been talking about, I think the first thing we need to do is move beyond procedural and prescriptive ethics, which is arguably a very narrow interpretation of ethics, because it focuses on things like confidentiality and consent, which I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be thinking about. But what we're proposing is that we need to move to a broader interpretation of ethics, in which decentralizing and decolonizing research is also seen as part of the research ethics agenda. So, because indeed the relevance of the current approaches we use are contested in the Global South, as they often seem to be quite Eurocentric in their approach, and they don't take into consideration different knowledge systems and different ethical systems. So yes, if I was to summarize, then I think what we need to, there's several steps I think we should take in order to shift power in research and in knowledge production, and therefore also to promote a decolonized research agenda, which I think is central to the issue of knowledge justice. And the first is to build a truly global partnership structure. And to do that, we have to have decentralized budgets. And they need to be decentralized towards the Global South. We also need to build multi-country and hybrid research teams and multi-country and hybrid ethics panels, indeed, if those pieces of research and work is taking place across countries. And I think it's then really important to co-design research, but co-designing, I think, in the true sense of the word, not designing it first and then going to the countries and saying, okay, what do you want to do here? But really thinking through what is the question that is relevant for our communities, and make that much more community-centered in our approach. Yeah, those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. What about yourself?
Yes, if I may add, Cathy, if we're going to decolonize research partnership, then we also need to be intentional about citing authors who are based in the Global South and trying to centralize different knowledge in the body of literature. We also need to be publishing in journals based in the Global South, and importantly, making our research output accessible, both financially and linguistically. Anyway, that's a great summary of what we've been talking about, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Talatu. So we want to open it up to any questions that you might have, and we also have a bibliography we've included at the end for anybody who's interested. Thank you.